food waste is a huge area of opportunity to waste less, drive down emissions, drive margin, and that's about experience design. It's been proven that if you put out a buffet more food, people will take more food. If you put nothing there, it looks really mean. So there's a balance there. Can you look at planning the amount cooked based on the number of guests coming through? Can you look at plate size, et cetera, et cetera? But nudging guests, if you can get it right, as lots of hotels have done around using towels, you can save tens of thousands of tons a year by one less towel wash per week.
Welcome to the Impact Files podcast. I'm your host, Ned Wells, and I'm really pleased you're here. Welcome to the Impact Files podcast. And this week, Ruth and I are delighted to be joined by Will Silverwood, who until recently was heading up sustainability at Whitbread PLC.
Welcome to the podcast, Will. Really lovely to have you here.
Good to be here. Hello, Ned. Hi, Ruth.
Well, really nice to have you here. Let's start with an introduction to yourself and to the work you do, and perhaps begin with your personal story and motivations for doing the sort of work you do.
Okay. So I guess my career has been fairly scenic. While I'm sitting firmly in the world of sustainability today, chapter one for me was nothing to do with sustainability. It was working with big organisations, quite diverse organisations like the Trainline, like Gala, Coral, like Siemens Communications, helping them develop capabilities and propositions that they didn't have before. And that was all well and good. Spent 10 years in a brilliant consultancy called Iris Concise, where I was number 7 in the door. We were bought by a big agency, and we spent about 8 or 9 years helping the clients I've just talked about, that kind of big, complex organizations, to develop and implement commercial strategy. And in about 2017, I thought to myself, I've got to do something new. Sustainability has always been a kind of deep passion of mine, although it clearly didn't manifest itself as called sustainability. As a child, I just enjoyed nature. And my hypothesis was that all of the stuff I knew I was quite good at, which is the front end bit, getting stuff done, still needed to be done to enable a sustainability outcome for which I'm passionate about. So I jumped into the void like Flash Gordon. And here I am, I guess 4 or 5 different roles into sustainability, really trying to make an impact.
So let me rewind a bit. I'd be fascinated to know what happened towards the start of your career. What did you go to university? What did you study? And then how did that turn into working on for Iris on those big clients like the Trainline?
So I'd like to think it was a well-planned route that I knew what I was doing. I actually studied geography at Manchester in the early 90s. Now, I think, based on the fact my 2 kids are at university now, that they do a lot more work than we did back then. I spend quite a lot of my time not at university studying too hard, which was a fantastic few years. But when I came out the end, I didn't really know what I was going to do. And really by chance kind of landed in a small scale-up business that was, I guess, a bit like the Betamax of videos. It was voice messaging before emails came along, but it was technology. Yeah. And it was projects, and it was operating in sort of enterprise solutions. But that's where I met a lot of friends who I still see today, including my wife. So it was a good first step, but really more luck than judgment. And that sort of moved me through the idea of delivering projects and then more strategic front office projects into strategy.
I see. That makes sense. Okay. So then it was Iris, and then you did the sort of sideways move into sustainability.
Yes, and that was an interesting transition because when you want to make a mid-career change, the first thing is asked is, well, what do you know about this new world you want to get into? And the honest answer has to be, well, very little, which doesn't equip you brilliantly for a kind of, I guess, an effective mid-level, senior level role, I was quite lucky. I picked up a role with an organisation called QA. They're a private equity-backed national apprenticeship business, and the brief was to digitize their business to create a much more profitable operation, which I succeeded in doing, and it was something I knew how to do. But one of the side effects, or one of the secondary outcomes of that project, was we almost completely decarbonized the business. So their emissions come from driving around the country, meeting apprentices, and that's really where all big scope 3 came from, or their big emissions came from. And we pretty well removed all of those. So, I guess it's illustrative of sustainability means different things for different businesses. And in that business, a key area was really to digitize it. But the outcome meant that I could talk effectively about knowing how to, devise and implement a strategic decarbonisation, which equipped me to jump into subsequent sustainability roles. So again, a little bit more luck than judgment, or maybe a bit of both. But anyway, that's how I found my way in.
Fascinating. No, that makes sense now. That all sort of slots into place. So you were with Whitbread for a few years. I'm sure a lot of our listeners will have heard of Whitbread, but could you give us a brief introduction to the business, the scale of the business, key brands, that kind of stuff would be fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, Whitbread, I guess, is one of the UK's best known brands. I mean, when in testing, it sort of comes up as right up there for a kind of trusted and authentic and well-known brand. But it really is an investor brand, Whitbread PLC. They don't brew any beer anymore. That used to be their core proposition. They bought and sold Costa. They sold Costa in 2019. They are really Premier Inn and a few hundred plus branded restaurants like Bar and Block, like Beefeater. Part of the business is consolidating to some extent, reflecting that how the market's evolving around sort of mid-scale restaurant. Real heart of that business is Premier Inn, and that is 850 plus Premier Inns across the UK. And in Germany, it's the fastest growing hotel operator. So relatively new entrant. Germany is a very different market. It's more operators competing, I guess, and a really good opportunity to get in there and become, brand number one. They're fast growing over there. So that's really Whitbread. There's about 35,000 staff who operate in the hotels with a support center in the middle of 1,000.
What sort of revenues are
over 3 billion?
Sizable organisation.
Yeah, sizable organisation, trading well, well established, a really tight operational business, and really a great place to work.
Brilliant. And how long were you there for?
For 2.5 years.
Okay, so that's quite a slice of time to work on the project. So we're going to come on to that in a minute there. That's interesting. Ruth.
Thanks, Ned, and thanks, Will. I really enjoyed hearing about how it was almost very organic, your journey into sustainability. And I think it's quite nice, actually, that a job can become about sustainability. And I think eventually, hopefully with time, all jobs will be like that and everyone will take their own sort of piece of responsibility. So talking a bit about the business case for sustainability and how you used to measure it, could you tell us a little bit more about how you kind of took these decisions to the board, how those decisions drove business results, if they did or if not, and maybe how it was reflected in the reporting as well?
Yeah. I mean, I think just coming back to the brand, Whitbread's brand is so trusted and it's so established in the commercial landscape. It's a given that as a business, there is a responsibility that's considered central to what goes on. So that's the kind of foundation expectation, but it's also a big, listed, commercially driven organization. So sustainability really sits as a kind of supporting imperative that sits in that business, I guess, below the surface. And from a business case perspective, there's obviously the sort of climate, there's emissions, there's pollution, there's waste, and we'll come on to a bit more detail about that in a minute. And that's a real responsibility. There's also a business case element about resilience for the future. So this is thinking about how in the changing world, from a supply chain perspective, are we going to operate, but also as the energy transition happens, how are we going to think about operating in that future world? And last but by no means least, the business case sits around people. So customers ultimately choose big networked budget value brand hotels based on price and location. It's not the sustainability message. However, the expectation is that the right things are also done by the operator. So rest easy is a phrase that's used in our kind of brand narrative. And that means that as you have a sleep, you can do what you do and we'll do the heavy lifting, and you can relax with the understanding that we're doing the right things for you. So from a leisure perspective, from a guest perspective, it's not necessarily seen as a determinant of choice. From a business perspective, it is more and more. So this is where regulation, in a way, is to some extent is tying things together, because we're the scope 3 of a lot of our business guests. 50% of our guests were business guests. About half of those were booked by business bookers. So that's typically based on a contract or some kind of arrangement. And during that transaction, or the preparation for that transaction, the questions are, how sustainable are you as an operator? And some of that booking is done kind of direct through a booking platform. Some of it's done through aggregator platforms like HRS, for example. And we need to exist on those platforms, providing qualitative data around what we're doing. So renewable energy, recycling, vegetarian options, etc. There are a bunch of criteria, but also importantly, quantitative information. So we provide hotel carbon intensity per room on that platform, providing data you move from a basic to advanced level, which accesses more bookings. So there's a revenue business case there. So that's a kind of, I guess, from a financial perspective, you've got leisure, you've got business, you've then got obviously an investor dimension. Whatever the narrative globally around investor sentiment in the US, in some areas, we don't have exposure directly to the US, but there is obviously transference of big organization invested in across the pond, and we've not been affected by some of that headwind in the US, but investors still see it as very important. I think so there's business case around that. Just coming back to some of the really sort of core elements of the business case, the easiest to understand ones are that we can save cost, significant cost, by using less energy, using less water, wasting less, and that cuts directly through to the bottom line. And that's something that we could prove in fairly quick turnaround and have done over the last few years. So the business case there is quite clear. Last point, I guess, is resilient supply chain. That's about protecting business value for the future.
Well, I just wanted to jump in on something you said earlier. You were talking about one of the booking platforms and saying that by demonstrating some quantitative data around sustainability, that opened up some more opportunities within the platform. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah. So in this particular case, HRS is a big hotel reservation system. So a lot of operators will sit on there. It's kind of an aggregator, but they have 3 levels. They have your basic, advanced, and pro. Become advanced, you need to provide them with a kind of checklist of X number of characteristics about how you operate, but also critically provide them actual emission data per room. So it's not per individual room, but it's an average of the performance of that hotel. And that can move you into a different stream of prioritized bookings. So it kind of raises you up the algorithm, as it were.
I mean, that's so interesting, because in sort of thinking about the theme of this podcast, where we're looking at the balance between business sort of economic metrics and sustainability metrics, the fact that HRS have decided to put sustainability at the heart of their business model and encourage their customers in quite a sort of focused way to motivated them to behave it more sustainably. That's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of, they're an enabler in a way, because if you think that any large organization like Whitbread also has a responsibility in whatever jurisdiction they exist to disclose their environmental credentials. So that means reporting. So they need data from us about where their staff are staying, because they need to report on it as part of their scope 3. So HRS
Right.
or enabler, in the same way as Booking.com used to have 3 green leaves, they've actually taken them away now and replaced it with an obligation of operators to have their own certification. So in Germany, for example, it's really important to have a certification, because it does affect, if you look at the left-hand side of the booking screen for Booking.com, you can filter out those that don't have any leaves, or you can prioritize those that are more environmentally friendly. So there's definitely an opportunity that's bigger, I guess, to affect choice with business guests.
And that is driven, though, by regulation rather than a sort of internal.
A little bit of both, I think. Yeah, but ultimately, these large organizations, we are part of their emissions supply chain, I guess, which they have to disclose.
It's so interesting, because only the other day I was looking at booking a hotel for a wedding, and I noticed, when I think it's Booking.com, it has the sort of sustainable option, and I always love seeing that. It's really interesting, and I guess linking to something that we mentioned in the briefing call from the sort of, I guess, individual or user, however you might call it in the hotel industry. You mentioned, Will, about these sort of customer nudges, and it was a concept that we really found interesting. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how you use those, throughout your kind of properties.
Sure. So I guess the booking choice nudging we've sort of talked about, and I think in the booking flow, I think surfacing any kind of environmental credentials to be done through the infrastructure of web pages, I guess. But if you do it through any kind of language, it's got to be really kind of authentic, simple, and brand aligned. We know from research and speaking to customers that things that we as sustainability geeks might think are sort of exciting and interesting mean nothing. So, don't talk about targets, talk about progress, talk about actual activities that you've done or doing. We were looking at surfacing just little icons that might suggest that we got EV charging on that site, or renewable energy, actually is in all of our hotels. So that's the kind of booking flow. When it comes to nudging customers while they're staying with us, that's a really interesting area, because I think while the heavy lifting has to be done by us as an operator, so we're investing hugely in infrastructure to lower the flow of the taps, which on a individual room level sounds fairly small, but as it aggregates up, you can save huge amounts of water. The next step, having done that, is can you nudge customers to have shorter showers? Now, this is quite a contentious area, and not one that I don't think anyone's properly resolved, and we were looking into. But any changes we'd make in the estate had to be meticulously tested prior to any kind of adoption. So you'd start with a very small set of rooms. You have guest scores, so you have guest surveys across the whole estate all the time. This is used for lots of other things, but so you test it and see if there's any negative around guest scores, not just from a sort of verbatim perspective, but from a data perspective. Do you see any nudging downwards? Test messages. We did this around before we moved to lower flow showers, and actually we didn't see any negative. The brilliant thing around the shower design now is when you aerate the water, it comes out and feels just as hard, as high pressure. It's just that it less is coming through the tap. Nudging beyond that, as in use shorter shower, is a touchy, difficult subject. There have been some trials. Accor have published some trials that they did where they are in the roof and they put a timer on the wall and they put some messaging, and they proved that they could reduce the length of showers by using messages like average shower time is 5 minutes 42. Can you go less than that? I'm making that number up, but it's broadly right. The challenge there is that, the infrastructure of buying that kit in every shower, you then have to think about the business case of paying it back, of maintaining it. Is it going to last? Does it need washing? So I think nudging at a room level is an interesting idea. Water usage is one that potentially could make people feel guilty. Recycling in rooms is definitely something that we've done. So this is about, before you put that in the bin, have a think about it and put it here if not. And then things like energy, big operational estate of 89,000 rooms, you really need to control that. While there's some fans, the right approach that we've taken and much more is around controlling air conditioning across the estate by hotel, as opposed to giving individuals the ability to kind of affect. So the other area is food waste. Food waste is a huge area of opportunity to waste less, drive down emissions, drive margin, and that's about experience design. It's been proven that if you put out a buffet more food, people will take more food. If you put nothing there, it looks really mean. So there's a balance there. Can you look at planning the amount cooked based on the number of guests coming through? Can you look at plate size, et cetera, et cetera? But nudging guests, if you can get it right, as lots of hotels have done around using towels, you can save tens of thousands of tons a year by one less towel wash per week.
I could just interrupt. And such an interesting piece of psychology, though, Will, because I guess what I'm reflecting on is that you want to attract people to come and stay in the hotel because it's going to be a kind of positive experience and enjoyable, and they'll recommend it to their friends and their colleagues. And so many of the sort of environmental sustainable messages that one gets fed day to day are kind of negative and off-putting about eating less of this and traveling less in your preferred way and doing this less and less and less. And so the sort of the balance for an organization like Whitbread of nudging people in a direction of using less water and thinking about what they're throwing away and eating less and so forth is a very interesting psychological sort of seesaw. And I guess I'm wondering, in the role that you had as head of sustainability, tell us just a little bit about how this thinking played out. I mean, somebody comes up with an idea to save water. How would that idea be sort of generated, in what forum, and then who do you have to take it to actually implement it?
Yeah, I mean, so the big gains we made on water were definitely done by our property team. So these are guys who have different taps and cisterns and basins and baths and shower heads and understand what gain you can make. Ultimately, a shower is measured on liters per minute. So you know that if you move from a higher to a lower, you're going to use less. So that kind of project, the flow through is, well, can we prove that we can reduce usage without affecting guest scores? And if you can, then you look at business case. The brilliant thing about using less water in showers is that if you use less water, you heat less water. So you're using less water, but you're also using less gas. Obviously using less electric when you've electrified the hotels. So that's a kind of, it's the science of the property team. And then it raises its head for a sort of commercial discussion with whatever sustainability or infrastructure steering groups to say, actually, this is the business case. We proved the guest experience. When it comes to things like, in-room recycling, there is again, as with all these things, there's a trade-off. For every minute you add to a housekeeper's routine, you're adding a significant cost to the operation. So there is, and time to the operation, all scaling up to 89,000, however many rooms. So, these decisions are made by lots of different teams, and to some extent, the head of sustainability there is, I guess, trying to be a catalyst in some of those discussions, is just trying to keep them on the agenda. But those decisions have to be made by big groups of people with input from guest experience and property and maintenance guys, and then it'll surface up to the sustainability or the property steerco, who will go, right, let's check the metrics of this. What's the savings? What's the impact on guests? And a considered decision will be made. But each decision has a different, I guess, set of decision makers.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. So you were at Whitbread for 2.5 years. I'd be fascinated to know the sort of, over that time, the sort of environment that you came into, what your mission was, and the sort of changes that you were able to put in place over that time.
Yeah, so I think sustainability in a business is a bit like a sort of forever running race. You know, you're taking a baton from the previous person in the relay race, and you're running with it. And at the different stage of the race, there might be a different speed, there might be different hurdles. And I arrived into the business when we had put in place a lot of the typically early stage things around energy efficiency. We had set up some of the people infrastructure around sort of governance and to look at water savings, and we're starting to do some very early trials on some of the, I guess, degasification, electrification of hotels. But actually, in order to move from some of the, I guess, lower capital intensive projects to some of the bigger, longer term, heavy lifting capital projects, required a different level of governance and a kind of evolution of some of the different levels that are put in place. And one of the things that we kind of evolved is the different steering committees that had to be, I guess, represented by different people, typically more senior, as the kind of capital investment decisions expanded. And that's looking at, so if I use an example, we are 800 plus hotels. You have to take out gas boilers. To get to net zero, you have to create a trajectory to remove gas. And we're doing that for new hotels. So new hotels that are opening now. So Swindon was a hero hotel a couple of years ago, completely electric, no connection to gas supply. All our conversions that are now going on when we're moving restaurants to hotel extensions, they're all possible electric. But then there's this retrofit idea. And in order to bring together the right, I guess, papers submitted to the right groups to sign off that kind of longer term capital expenditure, we set up newly represented working groups to approve them and sign them off. So I think that's sort of illustrative of the journey we were on. So, growing up through sustainability meant, I guess, expanding the reach and the representation of senior people in the business.
And one thing I haven't asked you actually is you mentioned net zero. We haven't discussed, does Whitbread have a kind of net zero target, a kind of 10-year plan?
It does. It has 1, 2 targets and Scope 3 targets. Scope 1, 2 targets. Scope 1 being obviously, getting rid of gas. That's in kitchens, which we're phasing out significantly. The technology development around electrification of kitchens has changed hugely in the last 5 or so years. I worked for the restaurant group before I worked for Whitbread. And even in that time, the discussions around what can't be cooked on electric has shrunk significantly, and all of our kitchens are moving that way. And then it's a case of getting rid of spoilers. It's a huge task. These hotels have 5, 8 big gas boilers, each the size of a car, small car. And, those are being replaced by big air source heat pumps, require planning permission, etc. So that's kind of Scope 1. And there's also F-gas that sits in refrigeration systems, etc. Renewable energy we buy across the estate, renewable energy certificates, REGOs, or GOOs as they're called in Germany, cover our renewable energy for Scope 1 and 2. And Scope 3 is the big longer term target. And that's as everyone in the sector is just facing into now, a really big cross-business question around what we use, what we buy, how we buy it.
Fantastic. Okie dokie. I think the final thing I wanted to ask you is just to get a sense of the scale of the team that you were working with.
So I think one of the things that, probably building on your question from earlier around what we've been doing over the last couple of years, is sort of also answer to that. While the team that has the word sustainability in their title is small, 4 or 5 people, or the people who sit within the business who support on different initiatives and work on different initiatives that sit in procurement and property, and the people team and the operations and finance, there are hundreds of people. And that's, I think, the reflection when I look back of the progress we made, and I think about the number of people who were involved in all the different working groups, the different projects, I sort of think the sustainability team, to some extent, our role is to kind of light the fires in business with the right people, and then get them to sit around the fires and prod them and feed them and roast their marshmallows, and then the sustainability team, to some extent, take a step back, because some of these things are very specialist. So, our role, to some extent, I think, is a kind of the fire starter and the holder to account. This thing's coming, we've got to deal with it. So, full team, lots of people, democratizing sustainability.
Fascinating, because you're the fire starter, you're also the lobbyist. I mean, I imagine there was an awful lot of having to persuade people, talk to people, bring folks on board, and then the sort of hard sort of numbers side of doing of at least starting off with the business case and then seeing that through.
I think so. I mean, it's change management. The different layers that you need to think about. You've got senior level sanctioning of strategy. You've got absolutely requirement to get sign off and approval for things you're going to do, but nothing will happen unless you've lobbied, you've made, built relationships with the people who are going to be doing it. You've got their input into the design of some of these strategic proposals, so that when they come along, or when we come along and propose them to the steering committees and ExCo, these are things that are endorsed and don't come from the head of sustainability. They come from the head of procurement, or they come from property. So I think the relationship between my chapter one of my career, which is kind of change management, transformation, and this is completely linked, because it doesn't happen unless you build the relationships. I think a huge part of a head of sustainability is walking around the business, buying cups of tea, having conversations, getting people on board, engaging people.
So interesting. Ruth.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I can't quite even comprehend how multifaceted it was. So thank you for sharing so much with us, Will. You mentioned a lot of compromises, and we all know that there are so many that are inherent with sustainability. Balancing guest experiences with financial needs, and realistic sort of changes to operations and supply chains. I was wondering if maybe you could share with us maybe some more of the challenges, and maybe some things that didn't go quite so well, as we've already heard of so many sort of great initiatives that you implemented.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. We've only really talked about the sort of environment, climate side of sustainability, and I'm not going to go into it now, but it should be also remembered that a hugely important part of this is the people side. And not only is part of the Force for Good program that we were working on had a really strong community engagement element, but also it's really important to think about our teams and how inclusive they need to feel in a big operational business, because it really links through to happiness, tenure, delivery of good guest experiences. But I think I've been reflecting on your question about what didn't go so well. I think, and about compromises. Compromises, it's about making sure that you don't go after everything, and you work out where you can win and where you can create tangible benefits for the business with the commercial context in mind. So a head of sustainability has to be commercial, has to come to the table recognizing what the broader trading environment is, what the broader regulatory or political situation is. Hospitality has had quite a kicking over the last few years with various changes around NI and business rates more recently. And, head of sustainability has to come to the table with proposals that recognize that. And, compromise, yes, but reflective, I think, of the commercial imperatives of the business, because ultimately we have to trade, and we have to trade publicly. So some of the things I bring to the business would be, okay, we'd love to do this, but on the basis that we're probably not going to be able to do that, let's do this minus this. So managing that from a compromise perspective, the commercial element, there's no daisy chains to be made as sustainability. It's got to be tough sort of commercial outcomes. I think as far as answering your question about what didn't go so well, I think I'll probably answer that in a slightly different way. An area that is hugely challenging for not just the hospitality sector, the food sector, but for all sectors with complex supply chains is our scope 3. So this is category 1. This is what we buy, and ultimately, as long as we buy and sell food, there's going to be a footprint. As long as we build hotels, there's going to be a footprint, and we have to kit out the hotels. So we've got 3 categories. We've got construction materials and build. We've got goods not for resale, fixtures and fittings, and then you've got food and drink. And where do you start? I think the realization as we tried to navigate to a starting line on this was you start this by establishing a shared set of principles across all the many, many, many people who are involved in designing proposition and buying the necessary products to deliver that. You split in those 3 areas, very different people from a procurement level and a property level, so a proposition level. This is about how do we get them all in one room, metaphorically, to understand this is the shared challenge, which is targets. This is what we need to do for the business. Quite often targets are probably not a headline you lead with. It's more what's right for the business. This is coming. This is why we need to adapt to it. And then it's a shared task that each of these groups of specialists go out and think about, right, so from a food perspective, what's our opportunity here? What are the big areas of emissions? What are the things we can do with which suppliers to affect change? On the basis you've got hundreds of suppliers, the realization over the last few years is you're not going to be able to do it all. So let's try and work out a strategy that is tactically deliverable. And that means in food, maybe let's talk to just these 10 suppliers and let's work out how we can work with them to do things more sustainably, perhaps look at product. And I think I could go on, but I guess just to wrap up that answer, this is really hard. And the way to do it is to ensure you've got kind of ownership within the business. This isn't sustainability doing it to supply chain and proposition. This is supply chain and proposition understanding what it is they need to do and why it's a business imperative. And that's also important to reflect and respect the business cycle, which is this sort of annual cycle of looking ahead, budgets, people, resource, planning, tasks. And you need to kind of get well ahead of that to make sure that as you head a long way before you head into the next year, you've done that work and you've got people on board and they're starting to think about objectives and potentially KPIs and resourcing so that as you head into the next year, it's in train.
I suppose a question that's occurring to me, Will, is with your perspective of having recently left the business, so you could look in perhaps with a bit more kind of reflective. As you were talking, I was thinking, gosh, all the people you were dealing with have got endless other priorities that they have to be dealing with. So how would you say that where would you say sustainability kind of sits with all these people in terms of priority? I mean, I imagine it's never going to be the number one priority. Neither is it going to be right at the bottom of the list. How would you say it fits?
So I think it comes back to the business case in a way. It's completely, for every different conversation, it's a sort of chameleonic business case. It's a different answer to the same question. For our head of food, the things that they're facing into around sustainability is very different to our head of property. But for food, the conversation is about resilience. It's about access to quality, governance. It's about de-risking the future. In property, I'm not saying it's completely different, but there's a lot of regulatory and planning stuff that's coming down the track. So it's not always a sort of an obvious conversation about cost or margin. It might be something that's slightly different. And the priority either needs to be convinced at that level or it needs to be supported by effective levels of governance. So, we had a steerco that was very well represented by our senior exco, and then obviously that then reported into the X curve, which a lot of them were on there, but also into the PLC board. So, you had to get sort of top-down approval for some of the heavy lifting, but you also had to get people understanding why it was important and how it could add value, and then they made it a priority.
So you're framing your sustainability need in terms that the individual will be meaningful to the department or the team or the
Exactly, the chameleonic element.
Yeah, fascinating. I'd like to come on to the strategic role of media, communications, and marketing in sort of driving this long-term sustainability agenda. Where did that sit for you?
I think that for every organization, the answer to that question is going to be very different. Premier Inn it's not Eco Lodge, it's Premier Inn. So, the proposition is always going to be, value, comfort, good night's sleep. And the process of leveraging marketing has to be thought of very much through, it's slowly from a consumer perspective. It has to be led by brand. It has to feel authentic. It has to be kept simple. And, you'll see by looking at any of our kind of consumer facing marketing that it doesn't surface loud. There are references to sustainability on our website. Through our customer, we're beginning to think about how that lands, but it will never be a headline. We might go large on a story around Swindon or, something we're really proud of, but also you need to be really careful that you might reference a kind of case study of something you're trialing. You don't want to go out and shout too loud about something that's in 3 hotels when you've got 850, because it just, it isn't authentic. So I think from a brand and a media perspective, that's not really going to surface very loud. Again, back to the business side, we all appreciate, I think, the opportunity there. All of our business teams are briefed around all of the things we're doing, and those messages from a marketing perspective are much louder and land much better in the audiences they're talking to. That might be very different for an eco lodge on a lovely island somewhere, an independent, but for Premier Inn, it's a different topic.
You mentioned when we were talking off air earlier, shareholder communications and how that plays into the whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, shareholders, it's really interesting because the maturity of conversation with shareholders is changing rapidly. So if you rewound, 5 years, shareholders would be asking more simply one-dimensional questions around carbon and emissions. Now, a lot of these funds and a lot of these investors have a much more diverse or broader appetite for companies to do things across the board. So this isn't just about, taking gas out anymore. This is about biodiversity. This is about plastics. This is about provenance in your supply chain. This is about human rights. This is about animal welfare, all of which is critically important for us. In our supply chain, we have to vet and validate. They come on board. They go through a process around risk assessment. That's super important for investors. And we'll jump on a call with them, typically requested by them, and they might ask us a series of questions around what are you doing to prevent human rights in your supply chain? What are you doing to ensure that animal welfare is of a certain standard? And that's a constant balancing act, because animal welfare is a great example, because you've probably seen the articles recently, the news recently about better chicken commitment from some of the major fast food operators. On the one hand, shareholders want profit, but higher welfare chicken will cost a lot more. There will also be higher emissions. So it's a kind of cost, quality, time in the sort of change triangle. You've got welfare, you've got cost, you've got emissions, and you constantly have to balance all of those. So with shareholders, you have to be really clear about what your priorities are. You have to kind of, to some extent, not be swayed by their demands. You have to be, this is what we've chosen to do. This is why we're choosing to do it. And that's how we played it.
But it sounds like even in the time that you were there, that whole, the sort of scrutiny from shareholders has become a lot more detailed, a lot more sophisticated.
I think so. I think the analysts and the people you're on calls with seem to know a lot more about what they want. But then sometimes their portfolio companies will have very different propositions. So for us, for example, we'd be asked around we'd sometimes be asked about questions that we have limited control over, because we're not a direct manufacturer, for example. And in that case, we'd have to sort of think about how we can get visibility or respond to it, or just simply park it and say, look, our priority is somewhere else for now.
So interesting. So we're wrapping up shortly. And I wanted to ask you where you think the sector could be in maybe 10 years.
10 years is, well, it feels like a long time. It's going to take us to within a few years of our kind of net zero target. Obviously, the country's committed to be net zero in 2050. We've got to make a lot of progress in that time. I would love to think that, supported by a strong and well thought through regulatory environment, the hotel sector has moved a long way to decarbonize its operations. And that would mean there probably a more encouraging sort of transition environment. So, perhaps more financial incentives to invest in this electrification. Obviously, energy prices at the moment are fluctuating massively. Gas prices, over the last few weeks has changed hugely, but there hasn't been a massive opportunity to recognize operational costs by moving to electric. Well, that would be great. I think from a regulatory perspective, it levels the playing field if there's clear regulation around packaging or around investment in lower carbon commodities, or anything that in a competitive environment means that you're a pioneer or you're putting yourself out there and compromising potentially your bottom line contribution is always going to be harder than when a government is saying, right, everybody, we need to do this. So I'm a big fan of the sort of well thought through regulation. I'd like to think in 10 years' time that we've pretty well decarbonized our hotel operations, and we've made really big inroads into working with suppliers to decarbonize their operations, and probably also affect our proposition to source things that are lower emissions. So from nearer, use less of them and less of the things that have higher emissions. But I think that will happen. What happens out in the broader consumer world will happen in hotels as well, because it will reflect, I guess, the changing consumer sentiment.
I'm also mindful of the considerable task ahead of the UK needing to change its electricity infrastructure so it can handle this move to electrification, and that's quite a large job.
It's huge.
Cool. Finally, one piece of advice for businesses that are pursuing sustainability objectives alongside their financial objectives.
I think do less things better, as in go at some bigger things in a sort of more ambitious way, because we are always, as sustainability teams and commercial delivery teams, pressed for time. And we all are hugely passionate about what we do and want to do everything, but sometimes you probably can bite off more than you can chew. Go for the areas you can win and focus on them. I know that sounds easy to do, but
well, I don't think it sounds easy. I think it's. I mean, we asked this question to all our guests, and it's interesting how one might expect something sort of really blindingly insightful, but actually it's often the sort of the good, simple things like just do less, just do fewer things, but do them well. You go, actually, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Will, thank you. That's been so good. How can people find out more about you?
Well, LinkedIn. I think that's the only place I kind of exist. And I'm always happy to chat. So if anyone wants to drop me a line, just do it through LinkedIn.
Fantastic. Well, that's brilliant. Thank you so much. Really enjoyed that.
Thank you.
Great, I did too. Thanks, Ruth. Thanks, Ned.
Thanks for joining us today. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, like, and share it with your colleagues. For more about the podcast, about us, our marketing services, and our wider support for purpose-led organisations, please visit our website at theimpactfiles.co.uk.